Should you play the new 1.1 update for V-Rising? That's the question you all want answered, and I'm going to break down all of the important changes about the patch so you have all of the relevant information needed to make that decision for yourself. First, who am I? I have over 1500 hours in V-Rising with over 100 hours in the beta alone, mainly focusing on PvP, so you could say I know a thing or two about the game. For those that haven't played before, the first question is, what is V-Rising? In the fewest words possible, it's a top-down vampire-themed survival game that combines many structural similarities of full loot wipe-based progression in games like Rust, with fast-paced, skill-based combat similar to League of Legends and Supervive. The player uses WA, S, and D to move your character, while left-click to auto-attack and right-click to pan your camera POV. And everything to include those auto-attacks are skill shots. You progress through your wipe by taking out PvE bosses called V-Bloods in order to unlock new spells, abilities, and gear crafting to progress even further. All of this while competing with other players in a PvP open world server where you build your base, hoard your loot, and can raid and be raided by other players. V-Rising has a lot of depth and I could go on, but you're here to find out if the game in its newly updated state is something you're interested in playing. So I'm going to talk about the 1.1 update, what's changed, and the good, the bad, and the debatable for all potential new and returning players. Let's start off with the good. With any big V-Rising update, there comes new content to explore, and this one is no different. While this update doesn't bring as much playable content or explorable area as 1.0, it does bring tons more quality of life and much needed balance changes, as well as a significant change to how much control and customization the players have when it comes to their in-game builds. The new area, Oakvale, comes with a new faction, a new blood type, 3 new weapons, 7 new spells, 6 new V-Bloods, and 1 new Shard Boss V-Blood. Additionally, all of the blood types that were already in the game got reworked and balanced, and the blood homogenizer was added to allow players to combine their 2 favorite blood types for the perfect concoction of stats and bonuses. This, along with passives, elixirs, weapon stats, weapon coatings, armor stats, and amulet stats, allow for a truly in-depth and fully tailored endgame to allow players to have complete control over their in-game stat values. On the topic of stats, we also can now use the Fusion Forge to take stats off of one weapon or jewel and transfer it to another, allowing endless possibilities as well as much less RNG associated with choosing your in-game weapons and jewels. And not even our trusty steeds have been left out. The new stables allow you to feed your horses based on whatever stats you want them to increase until you achieve maximum stats in every category. Another very positive change is the Treasury Room. You can unlock Treasury flooring fairly early from Nicholas the Fallen, and now anything stored in your Treasury Room will automatically be pulled when crafting at your crafting stations, instead of having to haul your materials back and forth constantly. I'm also pretty happy with many of the balance changes to meta spells, weapons, and abilities such as Soulburn, the Whip, Veil of Chaos, Spear, Merciless Charge, and more. Some things might need a little more attention, but there will always be things that seem overpowered to one player and not strong enough to another. Now let's talk about the things I don't like about this update, starting with the most important things that need to be addressed and ending with the least impactful topics. First is how overstatted the endgame is. For those of you that were around for the Gloomrod update and played a considerable amount of PvP in the open world, you know that you had to get your hands on a Storm-infused spear or you would have a distinguishably lower damage output compared to players that did. The thing about endgame metas like this is they are magnified even more when talking about an endgame meta player versus a player that isn't even max level yet. And in V-Rising, both of these players will be farming the same areas for resources and in many cases fighting each other. This isn't as big of an issue in the earlier progression, from start to around level 80. The stats that the players have at any point throughout the lower level progression loop still allows for a better player to use skill to overcome a 5 or 10 level difference. Fast forward to the 1.0 release, and now players have a plethora of potent stats available to them at endgame, not just the weapon stats like in Gloomrot. This exacerbated the issue even further of endgame players being way ahead in stats versus players just a few levels under. It got to a point where endgame players were able to gatekeep players that were just a little lower in level much easier and seemed to replace a lot of skill expression with stats instead, making it so your greatest advantage in a wipe became how much more time you had devoted into a server as opposed to skill. Now comes 1.1, and I'm disappointed to say that the gap between max level players and those that are slightly lower has increased even more, to a point that is pretty much insurmountable for the lower level players. If you're just 7 levels under max, 84 versus 91, to the naked eye it might seem that you're within a 10% difference of stats allowing for skill to make up the difference. Unfortunately, that is so far from the truth. The full meta level 91 player will likely have between 25% to 50% higher stats in every relevant category to include damage, mitigation, healing, and HP. This is way too much and why I believe the endgame stats available need to be significantly lowered. In my opinion, this should be a min-max sort of thing when you get to endgame, and you shouldn't be able to achieve more than a 10 or 12% increase in any of the A4 listed categories. All of this talk about endgame brings me to the next topic, which is endgame activities. If you didn't enjoy the endgame in 1.0 or expected there to be any changes to it in 1.1, I have bad news for you. Nothing has changed. You still have the same 3 activities driving the gameplay loop: rifts, raiding, and farming whatever resources you need. With the first 2 events being time gated and the last one usually being handled by your servants in the endgame, many of you have probably come to the same conclusion I did after a week of endgame in 1.0. How boring. Raiding only really happens on the weekends for 2 hours each day on most servers, and rifts happen once per hour and is a monotonous PvE farm that people in my chat were telling me reminded them of Diablo 4. And I haven't played Diablo, but my chat was telling me that comparison wasn't a positive one. Once you farm one, you farm them all. The only difference is the boss that spawns at the end. When it comes to raiding, many solo players like myself are hoping for some sort of change to allow us to be able to raid effectively. But unfortunately, we are going to have to keep on waiting since nothing new was introduced to that end. I would love to see some kind of dynamic events in the V-Rising endgame to give me more incentive to log on once I make it there. As of the date I'm editing this video, there are also still bugs in the game that have existed since Gloomrot. I'm not going to go too in depth on this since they could be getting fixed as I'm recording, but if you want to ask about specific ones, drop a comment down below and I'll reply to you with whether or not it's still an issue. Another thing that impacted my beta experience negatively were the new horses. With the new stables, it is now possible to reach maximum stats on any horse, but the maximum and minimum has been lowered overall. In other words, the horses you get early game are really slow and it makes traversing the map much more of a chore. I think that's basically all of my negative feedback from playing the closed beta. Now I'll talk about some changes that were significant ones, but can be looked at as bad or good depending on who you ask. First, the PvP combat has been slowed down considerably from 1.0. I can definitely feel it, as do many others, though it's hard to put my finger on all of the exact reasons as to why it feels this way. A lot of players are saying it feels a little more like Gloomrot before everything was sped up in 1.0. I talked about the spear being rebalanced already, and I think this is one of the bigger contributing factors to this feeling. It is such an integral part of PvP and has a little longer cast time on the queue now. Also talking about the spear, there is now diminishing returns on the crowd control and damage when you get spear queued. In other words, if another spear queue lands on the player after a short amount of time from the first, the victim will gain immunity to the CC and damage of all spear queues for a maximum of 5 seconds. The reason why this could be good or bad is, before, the meta in team play was basically to dogpile on anybody getting spear queued and you hit them with yours as well. So in quads, this could mean that one person could get spear queued 4 times in a row without being able to move. Side effects include death. Really death. With the new changes, now sometime during the second spear queue, the victim will be able to just walk out of it while taking no damage and ignoring the CC. That isn't the worst case scenario for the attacker though. The victim could also counter, allowing them to now have a temporary advantage as a result of them getting caught out in a spear queue in the first place, and a second player wanting to further press that advantage. That is the part that I don't like about this new change, the fact that the person who got caught out can now gain an advantage if the other player attempting to spear queue them isn't aware of this change or how it works. Alright, enough about spear queue. In 1.1, stat caps have now been put in place, so players can't just put all of their eggs in one basket and gain a crazy amount of any one stat. Though I do agree that these caps need to exist, they aren't currently low enough, as I've already expressed. I also already touched on it, but basically every spell and weapon were adjusted in one way or another, so some of you may find your favorite build nerfed, or maybe it's been buffed. I think that most of the changes were fairly good, with a couple of outliers still needing attention. The 3 new weapons that were added are in my eyes very situational and in large part underwhelming. Especially the claws. They just suck. The reason I have this feedback in the debatable category is because many people will think this is a bad thing. I, along with some of my more experienced friends, however, think that it's a good thing. When the whip was introduced in 1.0, it was incredibly OP and cheesy, and I hated the fact that I had to use it, especially against decent players that were also using it. In 1.1, however, the 3 weapons are not like that at all. You will be perfectly fine if you don't touch a single one of them, but if you do, you might find some sort of niche build you can use them in. The last change that I'm on the fence about is the addition of dueling. Now you can set up arenas in your castle or even carry around dueling flags in the open world where both players can agree to fight with no serious risk. While I do agree that this is a good addition for PvE servers, I wonder about the impact it will have on PvP servers. I worry that it will encourage many players not to go out and fight for high stakes loot and instead have playdates with other players within the safety of their castle walls. Well, that about wraps things up in terms of big impactful changes that came to V-Rising in the 1.1 update. Hopefully this helps you decide whether or not you're interested in playing. If you'd like to catch any of the PvP carnage, I'll be streaming my solo wipe on an official duo server on Twitch as soon as this video goes live, link in description. And feel free to join my Discord community to stay up to date on gaming news and video releases. I'll catch you guys in the next one.